Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, I want to talk about this dilemma, and a dilemma that, frankly, I hope will increase over time, the dilemma between diagnosing trauma versus personality disorders. Now, there's a couple caveats before I get into this dilemma of what should we do, and they're probably the most essential pieces. One is just disclosure. If you're familiar with my channel, I'm a personality nerd, and not a personality nerd because I like how it currently exists. Personality nerd because I see the potential for what it could be, that there's so much out there already waiting for us to grasp and hold on to and understand that actually humanizes and helps people more than the current model that tends to pathologize people. And so that bias, but I don't think it's a bias, I think it's frank understanding and appreciation for the human condition. We all have personalities, whether we like it or not. That is going to, be a part of this episode. And I think it's super unfortunate that the counterbalancing argument is one that I sometimes hear from both providers and clients, general public alike, is like everything's trauma anyway. And it colludes with the stigma that assumes that any dysfunction in personality is solely because of environmental conditions, despite there being significant research to the contrary. Never mind, it just doesn't make intuitive sense. People's personalities are complex and multi-layered, and to assume there's a biological component to this, even beyond what is disordered. It is understood that temperament is something that parental control and parental influence cannot fully account for, and it never has. And so to think, one, that the personality doesn't already exist, and two, that all personalities, all temperaments magically float through life with no challenges and no ramifications whatsoever, is slightly unwise. That basic adversity, basic interaction with fellow human beings, no trauma, not even adversity involved, interacts with this underlying biologically driven personality that creates who we are. And in that process creates, using psychodynamic language, it has the potential to create worst case scenario, these very light neurotic aspects of functioning. I cannot think of anything more humanizing than that. And it vexes me. Well, I understand because of what we've done to personality in our own field. We have stigmatized it ourselves. It vexes me that the counterbalancing force is to just dismiss it all as a function of trauma. And thereby, it is no surprise, if you've seen any of my episodes on trauma, that we've drifted on this concept of trauma and said, well, everything's trauma because it's not the super stigmatized thing. It's not so simple as this other diagnostic category. It's around historical experience that was aversive in some sort of way, or shaped something to become aversive. But that is not trauma. That is not trauma. Can it be trauma? Yeah, but it's not always trauma. And so we've got it reversed. Underlying personality should be understood first and foremost, and how it then intersects with experience, whether it's trauma, adversity, or just circumstance, context, culture, unrest, the generation within which you're born. That then intersects with this thing and manifests later. And it is wildly dismissive to be like, it's just trauma. It must have just been trauma. I know for the populace might disagree. It's like, it's so validating when I name it to be trauma. It's like, conceptually, it's just, the world is not you're okay and healthy or you're traumatic. That colludes with an all or nothing thinking. It is not going to be healthy and helpful for us. And I will note, good trauma-based providers know this, right? They're going through trauma work and they understand there's going to be residuals from trauma and adversity, from development, attachment in general. We understand there are going to be residuals that have to be worked on, regardless of any exposure work, regardless of any reprocessing work. Those residuals are going to remain. My argument is that can be, and has historically just a wide breadth of research, be extremely well accounted for by personality-related issues. Because otherwise we have depressive disorders and anxiety disorders, which can fit. but often they themselves diminish like the complicated layers of the human condition, of the human being right there in front of you. And personality is waiting to fill this void, whether it's psychodynamic research on more prototypically pathological versions or big five, sort of more normal range personality stuff that is emerging back of the current DSM, trait based understandings of people, that every yin has its yang. I can't think of anything more humanizing than that. The problem, though, again, to the point of this episode is like diagnosis is based on a illness pathology model right now. So we've got the diagnostic man of the DSM in psychology that only recognizes PTSD. They threw out complex trauma. We've got the ICD, which is more on the medical side. They recognize both PTSD and now complex trauma. And so there's a little bit of a widening, at least on the ICD side. I think the DSM was probably going to eventually fold on this. There's a widening of understanding there, but we have to understand even complex trauma. Go look at my complex trauma episode of like, have we taken it too far? Even complex trauma has a pretty high threshold for meeting that criteria. And so if we're listening to the criteria, even with the expansion into complex trauma, there is absolutely an area where things have nowhere to fall. And so the current methodology, the public and providers alike are colluding with, is like, well, just keep shoving it into trauma and it'll probably be okay. If you're a kid, you have attachment-based conditions, stuff like that, and we don't want to pull personality triggers way too early. And so there's this expanse. There's more things to account for and explore when kids are kids. We've got these more extreme versions of traumatic exposures and other conditions that are just symptomless in adulthood. So what do we do with these other issues? Well, personality disorders could be technically waiting. Then we look at the personality disorders and they're extremely pathologizing and say, like, there's no neurotic, there's no kind of mid-level, it sounds bad, but the psychodynamic borderline level of functioning, right? It's only the mid-level and more severe that are categorized there. They're not humanizing. I mean, they're humanizing, but they're not necessarily very gentle. When you read these sections, they feel not so great, and they speak about them as though they're unchanging, kind of doom and gloom sort of things. And so that's, I think, the problem. So if you ask me, based on the current system, the easiest diagnostic methods are if the PD is very clearly there and exists in isolation, you diagnose the PD, personality disorder. If trauma is there and it reaches truly the actual thresholds for complex trauma is only ICD, unfortunately, or trauma, then you confer the trauma-based diagnosis. If both exist, the nice thing about personality disorder being so severe listed is if you're still hitting this pretty darn strongly, and friendly reminder, or if you haven't watched, I think strong countertransference reactions, if you know how to monitor and manage countertransference reactions, can also clue in if it's severe enough. Then you confer both. But what happens in some illusory future world where we actually, heaven forbid, expand the scope and understanding of personality disorder, or call it dysfunction? And it's still not a great word, but it kind of honors that there can be dysfunctional aspects to our personality. When do we pull that extra diagnostic trigger? Again, right now we don't. I think it is most important, if you really want to get ahead in this field, or ahead of the schedule in this field, start doing personality research so that you can at least understand common personality variables and how do we intervene functionally on those variables. And so you can at least talk about this with your clients. Like, it's interesting based on traumas or adversities, your attachment, your upbringing. There's this strong dependency vibe. Noting dependent personality disorder has its own qualms and quandaries. Is it more of like a facet that's represented across multiple conditions, or is it its own condition, whole other thing? Isn't it interesting you have these heightened levels of dependency? And within that dependency, you're so fearful of losing attachments that you compromise your own values and you compromise your own voice in order to secure that sort of attachment. And we understand it's related to attachment failures when you were younger, but it's also something that you've continued to perpetuate after the fact. And, you don't bomb drop people on this, but it's like, you help people understand and observe and conceptualize themselves like, oh, shoot, what is that about? So that, you can move through whatever exposures you need to, narrative building through narrative therapy, whatever it might be, diffusion through ACT, whatever. But the problem it still remains right there in front of you as you've done the healing. Now that the core is more intact, more integrated, how do we then start doing something different with this personality related concern? Someday, I would argue we could put, PTSD. Say if PTSD is diagnosable, they meet criterion A, and then we can put with dependent, something like dependent features, some personality axis, which we got rid of the axis, or dependent personality, neurotic or low severity, or whatever it is. These powers that be decide are viable diagnoses. As someone who understands personality, that makes so much more sense to me than blanket PTSD or blanket CPTSD. That doesn't tell me anything about how the person is structured internally. It tells me nothing. Or if you do a trait based, it's like high levels of passivity and neuroticism or anxiety. It's like, okay, that's helpful. So underneath trauma, there are these personality layers where there's attachment insecurities and high levels of anxiety. So it's good to know there's this comorbid stuff that if we just listed it as like GAD or something would hold me nothing either. Like that is the future I dream of, where I would encourage folks to confer both, but perhaps of little use and utility, because I think most people already practice this way. In the current iteration of things, it just doesn't allow that without inadvertently pathologizing people. So I don't know if this episode is useful or helpful. I think it's just important, one, to really speak fervently against this, like everything is trauma, because it is frankly incorrect on multiple levels. And I think inadvertently actually dehumanizes people more than it helps people. But again, I understand how and why we got here. I just wish we could get somewhere else, so that the diagnosis system, which even with the addition of the CPTSD and the ICD is still more black and white, someday, maybe just maybe, we have a world where we can confer both, or heaven forbid, we can just confer some low-key personality issues, low severity, and understand that it's attached to attachment, and we don't have to create new levels of trauma, because not everything is trauma. Trauma is a construct that exists for a reason and has to have its own limits. We're allowed to have attachment difficulties and it not be labeled big T trauma, right? You can subjectively use that term if you want, but we can have attachment difficulties. We can have adversities that shape who we are and how we function in this world, and it doesn't need to be attached to trauma. And just as well, if it's not super severe or pervasive, it doesn't need to be attached to personality dysfunction either. So maybe I've led this episode astray, but as always, I hope it's interesting, and thank you for listening, watching, and then as always, again, stay curious.